Yes, first of all, I would like to thank Maria, Bach, and everyone for organizing this event. I'm really pleased to be able to share my thoughts on futurism on this occasion. So let's, right, here they are. Okay, so Alfred Barr's famous diagram illustrating the development of modern art, published on the cover of his exhibition catalog, Cubism and Abstract Art in 1936 at MoMA, marks futurism a canonization in the history of modern art. Posited halfway between post-impressionism and abstraction, within Barr's formalist and teleological framework, futurism was assessed despite the ideological implications that were so crucial in its history and development. According to Barr, futurist artists had successfully formulated a distinct transformation of the Cubist reinvention of the pictorial form. Although in his text, Barr adds some reservations about Marinetti's current political allegiance to the fascist regime, it's 1936, such formalist model became in fact crucial in the subsequent historicization of the movement and accompanying marginalization of its bonds with the emergence of fascist ideology in Italy. The definition of futurism at two moments in the history of the movement was another decisive move in this direction. The so-called First Futurism, spanning from 1909 to 1916, which supposedly embraced formal innovation and avant-gardist spirit, was soon to be opposed to the so-called Second Futurism from the end of World War I until the 1930s, which was supposedly politically corrupted by its alliance with fascism and formally derivative. Within this partition, Marinetti, at the center of this group picture, was mostly identified with the fascist impulse within the movement, while most of the artists, and particularly Boccioni, Umberto Boccioni, who is next to him on his right, were progressively redeemed from their implication with Italian fascism. So the separation between the two futurism provides a narrative of the good and the evil, so to say, that seems inadequate to apprehend futurism and its history as a complex cultural phenomenon. A discussion of futurism relevance for the history of Italian fascism actually only emerged in the late 1980s, primarily through the work of historians such as, for example, George Moss, who argued for a necessary reconsideration of the relation between culture and politics. According to Moss, one must connect aesthetics and politics in the parallel histories of futurism and fascism in Italy in order to understand how a number of themes that were conceptualized within the futurist movement, such as the new man, the emergence of a technophile nationalism, the cult of the dead that emerged after the war, found their way into the regime. As several scholars have underlined, writer Filippo Tommaso Marinetti and artists such as Umberto Boccioni, Carlo Carrà, Giacomo Balla, etc., among others, established an avant-garde movement that aggressively addressed industrial modernity and the transformations affecting Italian society. Their investigations of the new class and gender structures emerging from Italy's colonial campaign in Libya and from Italy's intervention in World War I, became powerful conceptual forces for Italian fascism. During the 1910s, futurists were instrumental in conceptualizing a new male aristocracy for the imperial ambitions that were to define Mussolini's regime. More importantly, futurism was a crucial factor in Italy's unfinished process of modernization. As part of the heterogeneous forces composing Italian fascism, futurism promoted a full embrace of modernity against the conservative inclinations of the regime. From the very beginning, Marinetti proposed himself as the avant-garde antagonist to conservatism in fascist Italy, but to say, operating from within the regime's cultural structures. But before presenting some short case studies, I think it might be useful to look at the reception of futurism within the paradigm of the historical avant-garde, especially as it was established in post-World War II Italy by Marxist art historians. Futurism removal from its compromises with the fascist regime was linked, actually, to the ways in which the relation between fascism and the Italian modernization was understood after the war, so Second War, particularly from the left. Futurism was in fact a contested object in post-World War II Italy. For a generation of scholars and intellectuals working after the war and the fall of the regime, and who were likely to be associated with the Italian Communist Party, which was a hegemonic force in Italy's post-war culture. And if you were an intellectual in the 50s and the 60s, you were most probably linked to the left and to the PC in particular. So for this generation, futurism association with fascism represented an epistemological and a political dilemma. In 1950, Carlo Giulio Argan, perhaps the most influential art historian from the left in post-war Italy up until the 1980s, I would say, openly discarded the futurist exhibition at that year's Venice Biennale. It was actually the second edition of the Venice Biennale after the war in 1950, and the first one had been significantly devoted to Picasso, which was perhaps the modernist artist that more than anyone else could represent an alliance between modern art and anti-fascist politics. So following the path opened some 15 years earlier by Alfred Barr, in the Venice Biennale in 1950, futurism was presented as Italy's most significant contribution to the development of modern art. In his review, published in the Burlington magazine, Carlo Giulio Argan dismisses, however, the futurist movement for its inner contradictions and its embrace of a nationalist agenda, even before its accommodation with fascism. Actually, Argan writes in this article that the movement was already over in 1914. Argan argues that futurism represented a rather limited and local contribution in the history of European modernism. In keeping with his Marxist perspective, he considered modernism and fascism as mutually exclusive. And this is why, in his review, futurism emerges as a dogmatic and merely polemical movement, expressing a return to romantic ideals that contradicted Cubism's search for objectivity. Futurism aggression towards the masses reminded Argan of the difference between art and propaganda and/or mass culture, which was, of course, his bad object at that time. Considering fascism as a moment of crisis within the development and ultimate demise, in his view, at that time of capitalism, futurism was understood as an anarchic movement that, and I quote Argan, gave voice to an agonized crisis of a culture grown old, rather than laid the foundation for a new consciousness, end quote. But interestingly, however, Argan went back to futurism just a few years later, in 1953, as he published a monographic study of Umberto Boccioni's work, and this is the cover. Whereas in 1950 he had accused Boccioni of having failed in freeing himself from his obsession with monumentality, here Argan deploys a formalist analysis of Boccioni's art, in which he develops a dialectical reading of the tensions between impulse and reflection that he had observed in his work. In underlying Boccioni's inherent contradictions with respect to fascism, as opposed to Marinetti, Argan deploys a Marxist vocabulary in which Boccioni's powerful modernism appears as fundamentally distinct from fascism, considered as an oppressive form of government. This analysis will be later expanded by Argan's former student Maurizio Calvesi, whose writings produced complex arguments that ultimately delivered Boccioni's work and subsequently Futurism as a whole, or at least its first period, away from fascism. Of course, this operation was only possible via the work of Boccioni, not just because of the emotional intensity and formal complexity of his work, but also because Boccioni's death in 1916 predates the rise of Italian fascism. Argan and Calvesi's formalist readings are based on a paradoxical reversal of the initial assumption that modernism and fascism were mutually exclusive. Once Futurism was fully posited within the formal vocabulary of modernism, and thus taken away from propaganda and mass culture, it became possible to affirm that it had nothing in common with fascism. In order to understand this, we must take into account the contradictory forces that were at play in fascist Italy when conservatism and modernization could coexist. But after World War II, fascist culture was mostly viewed as conservative. And whereas the PC, the Italian Communist Party, embraced modernity and technological innovation. So this scheme was crucial in delivering Futurism from the history of fascism through a number of arguments that, to put it shortly, very shortly, were linked to the modernist vocabulary of artistic autonomy and to the faith in technological progress that the Italian Communist Party shared, so to say, with Futurism. Interestingly, however, it is precisely in its understanding and praise of technology that Futurism contributed the most effectively in providing a new modern vocabulary for fascist Italy. This was concomitant with the process in which a new elite of the nation was supposed to rise from the ashes of the war and the demise of parliamentary democracy. As I would like to discuss later, the imaginary reconfiguration of the male body is the ambivalent center of Futurism's embrace of technology within what I would call a proto-fascist aesthetics. At the same time, the contradictory history of the reception of Futurism in Italy is also revelatory of the existing continuities between the fascist ventennio, the 20 years, and the following republic. Just to name one example, before the war, Carlo Giulio Argan was in charge of the Office for Contemporary Art under Mussolini. And this is probably where he started to elaborate his ideas of the avant-garde. And Argan later became a very prominent art critic, historian, but also a public figure. He was elected in parliament in the late 70s with the Italian Communist Party, and he became also the mayor of the city of Rome, I think also in the late 70s, also with the PC. So it was a very important public figure from the left. So this is not just a matter of individual trajectories, but of a more structural continuum between the two periods. So again, to put it shortly, after the war, the ambivalent relationship between fascism and the avant-gardes is turned into a divide. A younger generation now claims modernity for themselves, whereas fascism is mostly considered in its conservatism and praise for traditions, when not as an openly irrational parenthesis in the national history. So the parenthesis theory is very important also in this reading of Futurism. However, as Alfred Barr's diagram clarifies, such reading went beyond the Italian debate. Futurism, formal innovations, aspiration for social and cultural transformation, and the desire to get rid of the past were paradigmatic for the early 20th century avant-gardes. Needless to say, the movement also perfectly fits into the paradigm of the historical avant-garde as it was defined by Peter Böge. Its transgressive approach to art and its institutions, the attack against the notion of art for art's sake, the emphasis on the masses, and the desire to integrate art and life were equally crucial features. This is particularly true, of course, for the inaugural period spanning from 1909 to 1916, when such ideas were established. Despite the fact that Argan and Calvesi's approaches have been widely criticized more recently for their ahistorical formalism, their arguments, I think, point to two interrelated issues that seem still relevant today if we want to question the complex relation between futurism and fascism. The first one has to do with the fundamental instability and complexity of fascist modernity. The second one concerns the fact that futurist works, and especially Boccioni's, often provide something much bigger than fascism. As Christine Poggi argues, to bring futurism's contradictions and ambiguities to the surface implies a deeper analysis of its often traumatic responses to the shocks of modernity. Such an analysis is perhaps equally important for our understanding of historical fascism as well as of its current variations. So, first, case study, technological autogenesis. From the very beginning, as you all know, I guess, futurism embraces industrial modernity and the experience of speed provided by new technologies. The car, in particular, becomes one of the most significant futurist fetishes, as it clearly emerges from the first Futurist manifesto and then from a series of works that deals with the car. So the first Futurist manifesto that was written by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti and published in the French newspaper Le Figaro in 1909. And actually the car is a recurrent figure in Marinetti's writings in general, as it becomes the symbol of speed and modern life, opening up a new technological potential for the human body. Often described as a shark or as a centaur, the automobile is represented as an animate, almost human figure. The fantasy of an erotic interaction between the man and the machine plays a crucial role in the futurist cult of modernity and in the manifesto, in the first manifesto in particular. Marinetti's technophile ideology is largely based on the fantasy of an armed and heroic male body represented as a sort of projectile whose speed allows it to dominate space and time. In Marinetti's writings, the fantasy of a bodily transformation via technology mostly implies a male subject who aggressively faces its modern environment. The first manifesto narrates, the first part of the manifesto narrates the story of the birth of the futurist man, which follows a violent collision between the organic body of Marinetti himself and the machine. In the opening of the manifesto, which predates the declamation of its different points, which precedes the declamation of its different points, Marinetti, in his typically emphatic style, that you have a sample here, recounts his recent car accident in the industrial outskirts of Milan, when him and his car had fallen into a ditch. And here there is a picture of the car crash that was published in the newspaper Corriere della Sera, and then a picture of Marinetti in his car. So he transforms the event of this car crash in the manifesto, where he writes that in order to avoid two cyclists that look like, I quote, two persuasive but contradictory reasons, he decided to jump into the ditch. Of course, he didn't jump at all, he just fell into it anyway. So the car crash is transfigured in the manifesto in an act of pure will, leading to the birth of the new futurist man. And here a small quote. Well, please don't laugh. "Oh, maternal ditch, almost full of muddy water. Fair factory drain. I gulped down your nourishing sludge, and I remember the blessed black breast of my Sudanese nurse. When I came up, so from the ditch, torn, filthy, and stinking from under the capsized car, I felt the white-hot iron of joy deliciously pass through my heart. And yeah. So first of all, the two bikers, that's an important detail. The two bikers that prompted Marinetti's car accident symbolize on one side an already surpassed man-machine interaction, an old technology, and suggest precisely a conflict between the new technological development and this kind of old 19th century technologies. But moreover, their presence indicates also Marinetti's anti-democratic ideas. If we consider that the bikers are described as persuasive but contradictory reasons, thus referring to the parliamentary debates opposing the two mainstream political parties in early 20th century Italy, the socialists and the liberals. So the narrative of the accident stages a violent conflict between past and present that is immediately understood in political terms. The colonial overtones of this passage are reminiscent of Marinetti's childhood in Alexandria in Egypt, in which a colonized femininity is identified with the past from which futurist men need to extract themselves. The feminine principle is in fact associated with everything futurism is supposed to overcome, and this you will find tons of examples throughout the Futurist Manifest. Of course, traditions in art and culture, the academy, parliamentary system, feminism, romanticism, kill the moonlight, etc., destroy Venice, etc. The passage of the manifesto that I've just read suggests a narrative of traumatic collision between past and future, marked by a symbolic death and rebirth. Instead of emphasizing the violence of the accident, Marinetti chooses to represent it as a foundational moment giving birth to a new man, which will soon represent the modern elite of the nation. As we have seen, the industrial ditch in which he suddenly finds himself is compared to the maternal body. His account of his triumphant departure from the ditch's muddy waters refers to the passage from an organic past towards a fully technological future. This opposition is marked by sexual difference, as upon emerging from the industrial waters, the newly born futurist man can fully enter a modern male world and address, as Marinetti writes, all the living men. The episode of the accident is paradigmatic of the futurist fantasy of a male technological body that is able to resist the shocks of modern life. In Marinetti's writings, the interaction between the human body and the machine always takes place within a rigid system of authority and subordination, in which the male subject has to overcome both its organic, so also feminine past, and the violence of modern life. Nature has thus to become fully technologized, and in turn, technology itself appears as constantly humanized. Marinetti's fantasy of a futurist becoming machine is predicated on this paradox. So, second example, the male body, war, and technology. In his text called The Multiplied Man and the Reign of the Machine, written in 1911 and published in a collection of texts in 1915 called Guerra, sola igiene del mondo, war, the unique words hygiene, something like that. Here Marinetti deepens his analysis of the structural link between the futurist Superman and industrial modernity. Here he proposes a sort of Lamarckian view of the development of the human species and considers the body as an organism able to adapt to new external conditions. He therefore describes an augmented male body that, much like a modern soldier, can fully dominate his surroundings. This evolution is described as follows in this short passage. Where he writes, "We look for the creation of a non-human type in whom moral suffering, goodness of heart, affection, and love, those soul-corrosive poisons of inexhaustible vital energy, soul interrupters of our powerful bodily electricity, will be abolished. This non-human and mechanical being, constructed for an omnipresent velocity, will be naturally cruel, omniscient, and combative. He will be endowed with surprising organs adapted to the needs of a world of ceaseless shocks. From now on, we can foresee a bodily development in the form of a prow from the outward swell of the breastbone, which will be more marked the better an aviator, the man of the future, becomes." End quote. So this passage is emblematic of Marinetti's fantasy of a process in which the human body is turned into a technological engine. Such dreams of a fusion between metal and flesh provide the image of a hard, impenetrable, and phallic body deprived of psychological complexity and thus fully armed to face the internal as well as the external dangers of modern life. The insistence on speed, the aviator, as a figure of technological velocity, suggests the stimulating forces of an explosive and expanding male subject whose aim is to dominate time and space. Here the body is experienced as pure exteriority in his becoming a mortal weapon. Marinetti was actually obsessed with this fantasy of an armed male body that comprised the exterior environment within the self. The idea of a dynamic interaction between the animate energies of life and lifeless matter is equally central in Umberto Boccioni's conception of the male body. Boccioni was perhaps the artist that worked more closely with Marinetti in the 1910s, in the early 1910s at least, as both shared a common interest for the possibility to express the life of matter. It is probably within this dialogue that Boccioni creates what is possibly the most accurate and accomplished version of the futurist new man. His famous unique forms of continuity in space of 1913 expresses the futurist understanding of a male metallic body entirely projected towards the future. This sculpture fully translates what Christine Poggi calls the futurist dreams of metallized flesh, a fusion between life and death that provides the most powerful representation of the futurist cyborg soldier. As she observes, its formal strength lies in its synthesis of a series of opposing qualities, in which the differences between hot and cold, movement and stillness, unity and fragmentation are held in suspension. It has been emphasized that this sculpture perfectly responds to Marinetti's description of the futurist Superman that I have just read. Not just because of the sense of bodily transformation, possibly those wings that you can see kind of, here, the wings that could possibly develop out of the shoulders, etc., but also for its reference to war, via the image of an aggressively armed body that is both aviator and warrior. It has this aviator kind of hat. And actually this figure of the aviator, the warrior aviator, is particularly important in pre-fascist Italy. The Aviator had already appeared in Marinetti's colonial novel called Ma Farca le Futuriste, revolving around the creation of a child born without a mother, a typically avant-garde theme, yet another tale of male autogenesis. The novel Ma Farca the Futurist tells the story of Gazurma, the son of Ma Farca, the futurist, which is a male robot, so the son is a male robot representing the metallic man of the future, the pure and incorruptible product of will and technology, of male will and technology, part human, part machine and airplane. By the end of the 1910s, the iconography of the Aviator was appropriated by both Marinetti and Mussolini, as well as by Gabriele D'Annunzio, another writer and poet who played a decisive role in the emergence of fascist culture in Italy. It was actually through aviation, the most modern of all technologies, that Italy had attempted to affirm itself as an imperial power, in particular through the campaign in Libya in 1911 and 1912, and Marinetti had, of course, participated in it. But let's go back to the unique forms of continuity in space. Some critics have underlined its formal resonances with one of the symbols of the tradition that the futurists wanted to destroy, the victory of Samothrace. This parallel is in fact revelatory of Boccioni's ability to synthesize aerial dynamism with a form of eroticism, but it also indicates his connection to an established tradition in sculpture, the classical form. The sculptor's monumentality, in fact, is based on a series of balances and counterbalances, I'm talking about Boccioni's sculpture, that determine its dynamism, but that also give the impression that the statue is strongly anchored and therefore static. In his elaboration of the heroic male nude, Boccioni aimed at inventing a new, modern and scientific representation of the male body against the neoclassical model that was still dominant in early 20th century Italy. Think of Canova, for example. He believed that the human body was the locus of a dynamic interaction involving contradictory forces, the animate energy of life and the inanimate matter of the body's environment. So the title indicates the notion of a continuity between energy and matter, between emotional and mental states and the technological environment of the modern city. Such continuity also includes, I believe, life and death, a particularly crucial factor for an artist that, much like many of his male contemporaries, was obsessed with war. In its attempt to synthesize continuity between these two poles, Boccioni's sculpture searches for a new cohesion of the male subject, facing the threats of disintegration and fragmentation prompted by technological modernity and ultimately by war. In this perspective, the formal concerns that occupy Boccioni in the elaboration of this specific work express his own conception of the futurist Superman, so to say. Its formal contradictions between expansion and constraint, between excess and control, provide the image of a petrified fluidity in which the body's endless expansion is in fact contained, almost frozen between liberation and restraint. I believe that this contradiction, instead of delivering Boccioni from the cultural climate leading to the rise of fascism, points precisely at the psychic and social tensions that contributed so strongly in establishing such climate. Boccioni's fist, il pugno di Boccioni. Okay, Umberto Boccioni died in August 1916 following a fall from a horse while he was training for military exercise. He had volunteered, like all the futurists actually had volunteered, as soon as Italy had entered war in 1915 on the side of France. Boccioni's death produced a crisis within the Futurist movement, as not only he was perceived as the most significant Futurist artist, but also because he was the first member of Italy's cultural elite to die in the war. From now on, the figure of Umberto Boccioni becomes an invisible link, binding together the male energies that the Futurists wanted to establish for modern Italy. As we have seen, Futurism was obsessed with the fantasy of a triumphant virility associated with war, technology, and nationalism. In this framework, male relationships constituted the cement for such a phantasmatic image. Giacomo Balla's Boccioni's Feast from 1915 and 1916 is both a futurist homage to Boccioni and a symbol of the continuities upon which Futurism conceived itself after the war. In post-World War I Italy, Boccioni became the symbol of both the Futurist movement and of its contribution in blood to the war that gave birth to fascism. First conceived in 1915 by his former teacher, actually Balla, while Boccioni was still alive, from 1916 on, Balla provided a series of variations of what became a modernist figure emblematizing the power of Futurist art. Boccioni's Feast was first a graphic figure on the left that later became a sculptural form, sculptural object, often reproduced in documents related to Futurist initiatives. The pervasiveness of this image in the post-World War II period attests of the Futurist cult of the death, exemplified in Marinetti's affirmation that Boccioni still lived through his art. From a more formal perspective, Balla's figure, with its complex line of forces and dynamic energies, became emblematic of Futurism's association of violence and formal innovation. Futurist art was thus conceived as a powerful male energy that had violently entered Italian culture. Boccioni's Fist thus refers to Futurism fostering of a new kind of relation between man that could continue to live beyond death. From now on, Boccioni occupies a strategic role in the history of Futurism because it provided the mythical narrative for its origins and development. After the war, by way of the Futurist cult of Boccioni, death was reconceptualized as an active force for the present, thus providing a mythical structure for the movement's changing definitions throughout the 1920s and 30s. Such mythical structure was predicated on the ideal of a male community conceived as the avant-gardist elite of the nation. So to conclude briefly, I would say that Futurism's ability to conceive of a process of modernization based on traditional structures of authority and subordination might be considered as a significant aspect in the emergence of fascist culture in Italy. At least in the 1910s, Futurism was successful in positioning itself as the avant-garde of the nation in a context in which the process of modernization was confronted to a society that was, in many ways, still strongly attached to its tradition. And in addition, there was a very strong divide between the industrialized and developed north and the rural and underdeveloped south, the divide that is still dramatically present today in Italy. And of course, Futurism happened in the north, not in the south, or partially in Rome, but more particularly in Milan and Turin. So perhaps Futurism's significance for the history of Italian fascism lies precisely in its contradictory representation of time, largely based on the aggression against the glorious Italian past. The Futurist cult of speed and velocity provides a mythical structuring of time, in which history is apprehended as a forward-moving movement. However, the representation of time emerging from their technophilic imaginary is rather static, like an endless present, which resonates with the fascist motto that one had to make history instead of writing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giovanna, for this, an incredibly interesting talk that works so well with the exhibition that many of us saw this morning, and I think sheds a lot of light on areas that might have been slightly more hidden within that show. We've got about 5 minutes for questions now for Giovanna and Anna. So if anyone has a question, there are, I believe, handheld microphones here.
Thank you both for these wonderful presentations. It made me think about the question, of course, which is well known, and I'm just sort of repeating my thoughts, that obviously what we're seeing is, and it's a long struggle, about this sort of definition of modernity, whether it is sort of a liberal project or a reactionary project, right? And I think this struggle between these two modes in which modernity can go and continue to go as we also enter the 21st century, and as we are well into the first third of the 21st century, is a still ongoing process. And made me think of this one book, which I'm sure you know, which is by Jeffrey Hurt, published 1984, called Reactionary Modernism. And I think it's a really important book because he takes the position, or he analyzes the historic moment of the Weimar Republic as actually the example of reactionary modernism, in the sense that modernism, as we define it, not necessarily a project that is sort of led by liberal politics, but is sort of always in that extreme struggle between the fear of, you know, the powers it has sort of created and the attraction that leads to it. And a lot of sort of figures like Carl Schmitt you have, or Jünger, a lot of German sort of thinkers of the Weimar Republic were very attracted to this sort of big ambition and love for modernity and the machine industrial complex, yeah, that it has created. It's sort of large narration and positivist view of also capitalism, when I have to say, yes, I'm wrapping up. I'm just wondering whether, you know, reactionary modernism and any of that is part of your thinking, and how you would comment on that.
It's for me. Yes, I have to admit that I didn't read this book, so I cannot respond precisely on this book that you're bringing into the discussion. For me, the question was to point at the structural heterogeneity within early 20th century modernism, where you could have contradictory forces at play. And also I was interested in looking how in post-World War II, in the time of the Cold War Europe, modernity was kind of hijacked by the left in a very ideological move. And this was not without consequences, I think, for how history was written.
It's actually not contradictory, right? This, that it's not necessarily contradictory.
Absolutely, no.
You know, that these acts, you know, this what you sort of describe a contradictory is actually sort of a systemic, let's say, development that's been theorized, you know, sort of within historical writing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with those ideas that you are bringing into the discussion. Absolutely, that modernity. I mean, if we look at modernity through the lens of Marinetti and Italian Futurism, of course, it contains a number of contradictions that were, I think, they were structural of the ways in which modernity unfolded in Italy in early 20th century, and how it found its way into the fascist regime, which was, of course, fully modern in many ways, you know, but it also contained a different forces that were composing it, that were more linked to tradition, to conservatism, etc. So fascism was a very complex phenomena, especially in Italy, also with how it dealt with the avant-gardes and with art, which was very different, for example, from Nazi Germany. It also it was also a longer regime. It spanned for 20 years. But I've read before, like this week while I was finishing to prepare my paper, I came across some writings by Antonio Gramsci in the early 1920s. Antonio Gramsci is the founder of the Italian Communist Party, and even for someone like him, it was only at the beginning of the 20s when it was clear that Marinetti was building an alliance with Mussolini, even though within a certain tension and antagonism, because of course he felt like he was in competition with Mussolini and also with the Nunzio on the other side. So even for someone like Gramsci, it was only at that moment that it became clear for him that there was nothing to do with futurists, that they were too compromised in right-wing politics. But it was not the case for early futurism. You know, at that moment, this praise of technology and modernity was very difficult to understand politically, probably. You know, also because futurists would collaborate with figures from the Dada movement, etc. So I mean, this is why we have to. I mean, I was interested in looking at which aspects within futurism worked from within the establishment of fascist culture, while at the same time acknowledging for a larger complexity of the movement. So I don't know if that answers to your question, but yeah.
Right, thank you so much, Anna and Giovanna. One more question? Yeah, sure, okay.
Hello. Okay. Thanks, of course, for both beautiful presentation. I just found very interesting in the closing of Giovanna. You were mentioning also how, despite all this interest for technology from the futurist front of the Italian avant-garde, on the other hand, fascism was very, you alluded to being very syncretic, because at the same time they were also praised for encompassing present time. The aesthetics of fascism are very much trying to bring together present, future, and past all at once by reshaping these like origins of Italian culture through classic sculpture and so on. So my question would be like trying to reconnect to the present of Italy, because now there was an image in Anna's presentation about Lega Nord gathering with that.
That was actually Giovanna who sent me.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't credit Giovanna for take the picture. Yeah, no, it was in a newspaper.
Yeah, but I mean, my question would be more like, because also you hinted in your presentation, Giovanna, about how right after the war, somebody like Ergan, that was working for Mussolini's government and joining the Communist Party, they were able to have with the Communist Party a great consensus, as much as the fascists had, having almost a similar belief in modernity. So I wonder what can we draw from if we can draw any conclusion from the current situation where, of course, you have another extremely anti-democratic response in the elections, but at the same time you have parties like this one and the Cinque Stelle that have managed to create consensus. Also, of course, dealing with the emotional turmoil of the last 20 years of Berlusconi's politics. So I wonder if you can comment on this image in the light of your presentation.
Very difficult question. Thank you. Yeah, and of course I've been, throughout the writing of this paper, I've been thinking of the current situation in Italy, also because there was election recently, so it was impossible not to reflect upon that. Well, I would say that well, in the current resurgence of fascism in Italy, it's not just Salvini. I mean, as you know, there are a number of neo-fascist or post-fascist groups that are taking more space, like Casa Pound, Forza Nuova. So there is a number of fascist groups. And I think that the way fascism is resurfacing in Italy, in a way, contains the heterogeneity and the contradictions that already existed in the 1920s. So you have groups that are more attached to an avant-garde posture, like who claim the role of the arditi. I don't know how you translate that in English. Ardito, like the avant-garde aviator, the forefront, which is something with which like Marinetti would identify. So you have this kind of futurist tropes that are coming back in some of those far-right organizations, and then you have other organizations which are more like into a conservatist kind of aesthetics. But it's very complicated. And for me, Cinque Stelle, for me, it's not so clear what it is. I have to say that I would be cautious in putting this in relation to historical fascism, because I think it's something that is it's still unfolding. It can be anything at this time. That's the problem, of course, with Cinque Stelle, that at this precise moment, it can go in different. It still can go in different directions, I think. Whereas Salvini is clearly endorsing right-wing politics, is clearly positioning himself in the far right, and he's hijacking the votes of the former right, and Berlusconi is, of course, the great loser in this battle. But I don't know if that answers. At the same time, in the field of the visual arts, it's very difficult to articulate that, because I think that maybe also following the ways in which futurism was reintroduced in a national canon of modernism, I think that the discourse, but maybe we can have a discussion about that another time, but I feel that the discussion on contemporary art in Italy is very much related to national myths, like the genius loci. I mean, it's very much about the local specificities. And I think there is something that has never been taught through the way all those tropes are coming back since the 90s already, in how they think contemporary art in Italy, and that those tropes really go back to fascist Italy, but that's another story.